Okay, this is just one podcast on mitigation, international institutions, and global governance, with some recommendations for way forward on how it can be helpful for managing health as well. In general, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change had not been very particular about health, but the last assessment and the continued intermittent reports from UNFCCC and IPCC have been focusing more and more on health impacts, especially of extremes and air pollution and so on. And of course, there are collaborations with journals like The Lancet, which put out detailed assessments of health impacts of climate change as well. This figure from this paper referenced down here shows the dimensions for conceptualizing global adaptation governance. The title of the chapter is of course Mitigation, but as we saw, they cannot always be separated, but also many of these agencies and institutions mentioned here are relevant for mitigation as well. So the scales here are global, regional, national, and subnational, and the scale of adaptation, global, public good, transboundary, national, and local, and level of governance of course are global, regional, national, and subnational with various actors. I just wanted to show this to read off the agencies that are also involved in global governance of mitigation with implications and co-benefits for health, of course. Okay, UNFCCC, which we mentioned, UNSC, the United Nations Security Council, G20, the nations, there is also G8, there is the IPCC Panel on Climate Change, and IFIs, which you can read here, are international financial institutions. And at the regional level, you have the European Union, ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. They have various funding mechanisms as well. And there are national governments. We can look at one examples of how US government is dealing with health assessment. And I'm sitting outside here. There's a nice view, but the light is this way and I cannot show it to you, but I'm also feeling some pollen and allergies. Okay, there you go with climate change and health. At subnational level, provincial, urban, and community, so the state of California, for example, in the US is very proactive on health impacts and climate justice and other related issues of disparate impacts of air pollution on neighborhoods, for example. Actors, of course, United Nations Development Project, AF is Adaptation Fund, the Green Climate Fund, the BBSD is the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, International Standards Organization, CAN is Climate Action Network, CARE is there is 100 Resilient Cities, Local Government for Sustainability, ICLEI, and so on and so forth. Okay, you get the idea. But we have to put that in the context. For example, here is a brief history of climate negotiations. 1992 was when UNFCCC was officially established. Convention on Climate Change agrees to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. So the focus has always largely been on reducing emissions and human impacts on climate, and IPCC actually preceded this in 1988 under the World Meteorological Organization. The IPCC was established. 1997 Kyoto Protocol came and went, but obviously by now it's considered largely a failure, I would say. 2016 Paris Agreement commits to a 2 degrees Celsius limit on global temperature increase. So a lot of the Paris Agreement goals have focused on that goal of drawdown, carbon reductions, emissions, greenhouse gas emission reductions, land use change for this global warming target. But The UNFCCC now explicitly mentions health in several specific clauses. 2018 Global Climate Action Committee allocates 4 billion to fight climate change over the next 5 years. Okay. This is the long road to a global deal, which I won't read, but there are many of these so-called Conference of Parties. 2015 Paris Agreement was a big one. So it happened over November 30th to December 11th. Paris Climate Conference with an aim of universal agreement to cut emissions sufficiently to prevent Earth's temperature rising by more than 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. 147 world leaders took part, 40,000 participants including 25,000 official delegates and 3,000 journalists. But you can imagine that the awareness and the attempts to have conferences on the environment started way back in 1972. But even the worst news is that despite this long history of negotiations, fossil fuel emissions, especially CO2, have continued to grow. There was, of course, some 7% dip in carbon emissions in 2020 because of all the COVID lockdowns, slowdown of economic and industrial activities, travel, and so on. Obviously, we are heading right back up. So this is not good news, which means action is lagging quite a bit. Nonetheless, to be optimistic again, the Paris Climate Agreement had 196 parties with commitments to reduce 52.4 billion tons of emissions, and there is a so-called nationally determined contributions that most countries have committed to. So these are the countries in red that have submitted climate change plan. Yet to submit a pledge here: Greenland and a few countries submitted but exiting the deal. So that was bad news, but now of course US is back in the Paris Agreement with Biden being the new president since 2020. Okay, the greenhouse gases, just quickly, this is already a few years old from the IPCC 2014, but of course most of it is carbon dioxide. There are flue gases, nitrous oxide, methane, and carbon dioxide from forestry and other land use, what is often referred to as AFOLU, agriculture, forestry, and other land use. Okay, and of course the other bad news is that the commitments that have been made under Paris Agreement are not at all sufficient to meet the 2 degrees centigrade goal. Only few countries like India and here, which country would this be? Oman or Yemen, or UAE, I think, are compatible with 2 degrees C. But big countries, Russia, US, and some European and Saudi Arabia are critically insufficient, and there are many that are high a real allergy, highly insufficient, and there are some very few that are actually 1.5 degrees C compatible up here. But of course these are poor countries, and what happens when they grow economically is not always clear. If they're a role model, I think there is some little country here, maybe I don't know which one is a role model. Okay, so looking again in a little bit of more detail at the global agencies that are involved in health. So climate mitigation, adaptation, and then the health aspects of it. You can think of it as co-benefits again. World Health Organization, of course, does a lot for climate change and health. This is just an infographic, but you know that World Health Organization is now a key player in all the health activities across the globe, coordinating, funding, data synthesis, gathering. Of course, it gets into trouble a lot, like it did under COVID, and the way China has released or not released the information and so on. Nonetheless, there is a World something assembly which under WHO which coordinates the activities there is the Climate and Clean Air Coalition to reduce short-lived short-lived climate pollutants, which has an explicit health component to its activities, so making air pollution an urgent health, climate and development priority. And it lists some achievements to date on its website. I won't go through all of them, but some examples include calling for and achieving a resolution on addressing health impact of air pollution at the 68th World Health Assembly. Yeah, this is it, World Health Assembly. Launching the Breathe Life public awareness campaign with WHO and the UN Environmental Program, and so on. It also is helping to obtain 130 government commitments to the UN Secretary General's Clean Air Initiative to achieve air quality that is safe for citizens and to align climate change and air pollution policies by 2030. Climate change and air pollution policies have to be aligned, and CCAP is part of that effort. Okay, and so on. Of course, there is funding the development of 8 resources and tools that support action to improve air quality. There are governments at all levels doing their own health assessments along with climate assessments. This is the example from globalchange.gov in the US. The impacts of climate change on human health in the United States, a scientific assessment. So this is what Christy Ebby has been advocating, and she's of course part of this, I'm sure. And that gives us a sense of how global governance of climate mitigation and translation to health are happening across various scales, from global to regional, national and subnational. This chapter recommends a few things for ways forward. Moving forward, public health experts, climate scientists, policymakers, scholars and advocacy groups need to frame the issue to improve public understanding and awareness of the massive human health threats posed by catastrophic climate change. Measures to consider include increasing climate and health impact and adaptation research, particularly in developing countries with weak public health systems, as underscored by IPCC. So there is IPCC's role in health as well. In the newer assessments, it's going to get better and better. Raising awareness of climate change effects on human health, human well-being, to increase preparedness to measure climate events and raising funds for adaptive capacity. Using rating efforts such as the Council on Foreign Relations Global Governance Report report card, to critically assess and improve governance activities and organizational structures. Incorporating a health in all policies approach on the part of multinational agencies, and thereby including projected health impacts of climate change in planning and policy making. Entities like the World Trade Organization, for example, could give greater priority to averting the adverse health and environmental effects of international free trade. So you have to link World Trade Organization activities, which governs the international free trade, to their impacts on health in terms of embedded carbon, transportation, air pollution, water quality problems, ships carrying ballast waters and dumping new pathogens and invasive species in other places far away, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's a quick run through climate mitigation, global governance agencies involved, and links to health and how things have to improve in the coming years and decades. Okay.